Hi, I'm Ed. Welcome to Common Sense.
And I'm John. How are you doing, Ed?
I'm good, John. Yourself?
I'm doing great.
Good.
So, both of us are marketers and part of the HubSpot partner community. So, I thought today would be interesting to focus on privacy. And what we'll do is debate several different aspects of privacy and its impact on sales and marketing, obviously, here in the US and elsewhere. So, why is this such a hot topic right now?
Well, there's a bunch of forces at work, and I'd emphasize that this isn't only an issue within the HubSpot community. This is digital marketing and sales everywhere. But some of the issues that I think have really brought this to the fore: data hacking. We hear stories about all kinds of hacking, perceived misuse, and I think it's important to distinguish between perceived misuse and actual misuse, because there's a technicality, but all of the stuff that's happened in many cases have been according to terms of use that we've all elected and agreed to. Now, the fact that it's 7 pages long, we can't read it all.
Right.
That's a different issue, but it's important that we're straightforward about whether it's actual misuse. And certainly all the discussion around the Russia investigation into possible election interference, I mean, that's brought so much of this stuff to the fore. At the same time, people are getting increasingly cognizant of tracking, and ad blocking is becoming a big issue with many browsers. In fact, Apple builds a lot of its kind of new technology announcements around this privacy issue now, and how they'll alert you to tracking code on websites that you're visiting, etc. And there's a whole financial angle. You go back to the Target hacks from 5 or 6 years ago with the credit card databases at Christmas, and just the recurrence of that kind of information, the sent in the meantime.
Equifax.
Sorry?
Equifax.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, perfect example. Absolutely. So all of these news stories, I mean, it's got everyone freaking out about privacy, right? And then throw on top of that GDPR, which just turned the marketing community inside out globally. For about the last 2 weeks in May, when suddenly this thing that had been on the books for three years came to the fore, and everyone was scrambling at the last minute to do it. And that obviously impacts European and non-European users and companies, and data collection, data retention, and all kinds of other stuff. I know you've dug into that quite a bit. So why don't you give us a little bit of the skinny on GDPR?
Well, we're past the deadline already, so that was May 25th. So if you haven't done anything about GDPR, including looking into it, might be a good idea to get going. But there's several issues regarding implementation and compliance. So first of all, GDPR applies to European users. So most of American companies might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. But it's not true, because if you look in your own database, if you've been doing any kind of online marketing, chances are a fairly large proportion are from Europe. So you have EU people in your contact database. So, there really isn't an easy way to block EU users. I've read stories about large companies, including newspapers, that have attempted to do so because they couldn't get their act together on all the compliance. So that's a possibility, but it's not practical. And why would you even want to? I mean, maybe your customers are in Europe, so you wouldn't want to block a whole continent. But then the flip side, the penalties are huge. At least that's what they're saying, up to possibly 4% of gross revenues. And if you're an enterprise, that could be millions of dollars. And then I hear a lot of my fellow marketers saying it just doesn't apply to us and it won't be enforced here in the US. But I think that's a mighty dangerous assumption. And are you really willing to bet your company on it? And then, personally, I think it makes a lot of sense. If we say we're solving for our customers, like we always do, shouldn't that include protecting their privacy and their data and not sharing it or selling it? So what do you think about this, Ed?
Well, I think your point is absolutely right. And I think that there will, particularly with some trade and policy irritation between the US and the EU, it's likely that there'll be somebody will be the lightning rod, the test case, the one that's tried to use to make a point for everybody, and somebody is going to get crushed under this regulation. I'm not convinced that it really applies as much to American SMBs, particularly if they're not seeking to sell internationally. If they get international leads and they delete them, if they're appropriate in some of the basic kind of best practices, double opt-in and notifying people of cookies and some of that kind of stuff, I think the risk is relatively low. It feels in many ways kind of like a Y2K thing. I mean, right. After all, there's millions or hundreds of thousands or thousands of SMBs, depending on what size you're looking at. And who's going to police them all? I mean, the EU doesn't have budget to do that. And even getting a claim doesn't mean actually realizing the judgment and all of that. So I think you make a good point that there's a business decision to be made and some kind of a risk decision to make, that if a company is moving in the right direction, if they're aware of it, if they're taking some steps, if they're demonstrating an intent to try to move toward compliance, including updating landing pages and being more transparent, and maybe even finding a GDPR consultant, updating their legal terms and stuff. I mean, those are demonstrations or manifestations of at least positive intent. And if you're making moves like that, in many cases, even if you're being investigated, you've got a reasonable defense saying, hey, we're a small company. This is an enormous regulation. The big guys don't even know exactly how to respond to it. We're doing the best we can. So it's really a business decision in many cases, as much as it is kind of a compliance thing. But you mentioned that protecting user privacy is the right thing to do, and I absolutely agree with that. I'd say there's also a couple other considerations. First, one of the things I'm already starting to see some reports about is buyers are frustrated. There's some backlash because we've become accustomed to the convenience that comes with some of the tracking. Marketoonist had a great cartoon yesterday, Monday, would have been the 18th of June, I guess, 2018, that kind of went through a consumer sitting there in front of the computer, canceling all of the tracking, and then the last kind of bubble in the cartoon is, well, now why don't I have the same user experience? Well, your suggestions from Netflix, your recommendations from Amazon, all of that stuff that we've come to rely on ties in with this. So, getting the news stories in a digest that you can consume very quickly because they know the kind of stories you want to read. Those are all examples of the experiences that we're accustomed to having personalized that won't be. And then, of course, there's also, as companies, there's a potential implication to our revenue. If we've done a good job segmenting and personalizing, and that's helped us to attract and nurture and close more customers, we're talking about changing that. And I'm not saying that it's not the right thing to do, even if there is a revenue impact, but it's something that we certainly need to be aware of and discuss.
Yeah, I agree. I do think, though, that at least to some extent, the train has already left the station.
For sure.
Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and a lot of other tech companies are really working on this. It's a big trend to make it easier for users to block ads, just make it a more private experience online, and, less fraud, less fake news, all those sorts of things. So I don't think, we can argue about that, but I think it's going to happen anyway, just because it's in the interest of those companies and their consumers,
right,
to put the hammer down on some of this more malpractice that's gone on. And I think the other thing is that we have to be concerned about the compliance issue, because even though you may not be directly violating users in Europe and elsewhere, if you're working with other companies that are, for example, storing the data for you and they get sued, you could get sued too. So, it's really worth, like you said, it's worth looking into, taking some of this first steps at least to make sure that you at least understand the issues and you're looking into all the aspects of that. But I do think, with this trend thing going on, if you take that to the extreme and privacy really becomes strictly enforced worldwide, which it could ultimately, that really would possibly be the end of digital marketing as we know it, at least a large part of what we now do as a general practice. So like you said, it's really a question of whether people want the experience or the privacy, or what's the right mix. So, you're active in this space. You're selling buyer intent data. What are your perspectives on that?
So you raise a couple great points, and I definitely want to talk about buyer intent data. A couple other things that come to mind as you're talking. Cloud introduces a lot of interesting regulatory and compliance issues. Even American companies selling export controlled products using, for instance, Salesforce, that put export controlled information into the cloud are potentially exposed if that information is mirrored in an overseas server. There's all kinds of stuff that hasn't really been worked with and litigated yet. And there's also an issue around, how people can get that experience. I believe that ultimately what's going to happen, as you say, things get tightened up. I think there's going to be some kind of a middle layer that's built to let people manage their opt-ins and that kind of thing. It's kind of fun to think about. Who knows how it gets built? But anyway, buyer intent data. You make a great point about how that ties in. It's something that I think about a lot, and a lot of people ask me about. So I'd say there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all of the data that we provide as buyer intent data is publicly available. It's wicked, to use a Boston term, wicked hard to figure out how to find that and how to aggregate it. And so really the art and the science is in how to do that. But it's all publicly available information. Second, having the data is one thing, using it is another. Now, it's easy to say, oh, well, we provided the data, somebody else misused it. We spend a lot of time helping clients understand how to use it responsibly and appropriately so that they're actually providing value and not damaging their brand. And by value, I mean, if according to buyer intent data, that somebody is actively researching solutions to a problem or, potential vendors or how to understand or achieve an outcome, then it stands to reason that they want to see a full range of solutions and they want to potentially discover one that they might not be aware of. And so if you use it correctly, I believe, and this sounds salesy, but you're actually helping to provide information that's going to help them do their research better. And by definition, people that we're reporting in buyer intent data are taking actions online that indicate specific interest or intent around a product or service. So if the information that's provided, that's delivered, whether it's through Facebook ads or sequences or whatever the case may be, if it's really focused on helping them solve that problem, then I think in many cases, people at worst ignore it and at best appreciate it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you're doing that and providing that education. I really think that's a missing piece for a lot of marketers. And we probably need to be thinking about doing that across the board, explaining how your data is actually being used. And that's part of GDPR, is to be more transparent about
those explanations. Somebody's got to come up with a good way to make those easy to digest and to understand.
Yeah, exactly.
Not
a 5-page terms of service.
Right.
Yeah, that's written in legalese and no one understands. So let's go back to the basic dilemma, I guess, we're facing, and that is that all of us are both consumers as well as professionals. In our case, we're marketers. So this whole issue is confusing. As consumers, we're very much happy to have our data protected, and we'd really like to receive less spam from marketers. So, we have that. But then on the other hand, we don't want our livelihoods to go away. So that competes. And then, it's true what you said earlier, that people still do respond to digital ads and emails because they want those products and they appreciate getting a deal for them at the appropriate time. So
right.
If marketers are doing their job right, they're providing a real service. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of data that's collected and processed that's in the public's best interest. So for example, protecting your financial data, emergency response, and improving services. Not to mention, police forces and emergency crews and so on. So all of that is important to keep in mind when you start thinking about data privacy. So it's very complicated. Where do you think we'll end up in this debate between what's good for the people and what's good for business?
What's interesting to me is that this debate is coming to a head because of Facebook and some of the other things we've talked about. But, for a long time, you've gone into the store, and when you check out at the grocery store or whatever, you give them your frequent shopper card that allows them to build a database knowing exactly what you're buying, at what frequency, what brands, what products, and they make a ton of money monetizing that, selling that back to manufacturers. And they spit out the coupons at the at the end below your receipt, specifically based on what you've done. This whole privacy thing, it's not new. For some reason, people have really gotten worked up about it. And I think that in conjunction with some of the hacks and the Facebook mess is retargeting. I think retargeting is probably the thing that's likely to see the biggest impact from this, because everyone just, if you talk about data and privacy, that's the example that everyone gives you. You go shopping for a pair of shoes or something online, and next thing you know, everywhere you go, all over that screen, top banner, side banner, bottom banner, pop-ups, it's all the same stuff being thrown at you. And that just aggravates, it abuses people. So I think that, retargeting is going to change, and that somebody's going to figure out, they're going to get savvy about only one place on the screen instead of all four. They're not going to do it on every screen experience you have. They're actually going to pay attention if you convert. Then they're going to stop serving that ad to you. Some of those kinds of basic things I think would help with it. But I also believe that buyers are going to push back on the privacy when it impinges on the experiences that we've come to expect, whether it's Netflix recommendations or Amazon recommendations or seeing the news stories you want to see. I mean, that's part of how we live now. And if we got to do 4 extra clicks, or if we miss something that we wish we'd known, that's going to create some friction. So ultimately, I think there's definitely privacy control, but I don't think it's at the level that shuts down digital marketing. That's just too integral to the experience that we all have. We need to be smarter and more transparent, for sure, about how we collect and use data and how we articulate to people what we're doing with it. But there's also already a rapidly growing privacy consulting industry, and smart agencies, the smart companies, I think, are going to provide these services and look for these services that will help them be clear about who owns the liability and how information is stored. Is it the party that collected it? Is it the party that stored it? Is it the party that failed to secure the data? And honestly, at the end of the day, I think privacy is getting lumped together with fraud, and that's creating a lot of emotion, because having somebody steal your money is a little bit different than having somebody show you an ad you're not interested in. And I think that those are going to be very clearly defined and separated as different kinds of topics. Clearly, there's going to have to be transparency. As you say, we always talk about solving for the customer, and up to this point, and even part of our conversation is around what it means to us as marketers, and that has to be secondary. It has to be very clearly focused on the buyer experience. But a lot of the kinds of changes, if we're thoughtful and creative, I think they can be mutually beneficial. Marketers will deliver a better experience that gets them better results, and buyers will have a better experience. So I think potentially, if people are open to it and not clinging too tightly to legacy technology that may not support where we're going, I think potentially it's a win-win. Do you agree?
I do indeed. That's a nice summary, by the way.
It's nice that we agree. We seem to always come to that point in the end. It's the highlight of my discussions.
All right.
So I guess that wraps us up for today then. Privacy is not quite as crazy a topic as we started out thinking it was. So thank you for joining us. I'm Ed.
And I'm John, and we're Common Sense. Join us next week for our takes on the future of owned, earned, and paid media. See you then.